Welcome to this fifth and final session in our study of the book of Revelation. In session 1, we considered the background of this book, which centered in the city of Rome, not just as a city, but as a symbol for the Roman Empire. And I mention that because we come today to a different kind of city. John wrote this book to people who lived in an environment that was marked by Caesar, the Roman Empire, by idolatry, by exploitation, by injustice, and by scarcity. And John gave us at chapter 1 the vision of the ruling Christ as a way of strengthening us to want to pursue the trail that would lead to the new heaven and the new earth. In chapter 4, we saw the vision of heaven establishing the authority of God as giving the confidence to pursue this journey. In chapter 6, we opened the 7 seals, which expose the depth of brokenness in the present age and point toward judgment. These themes were intensified in session 4 as we explored the first beast, the Roman Empire, given its life by Satan, having come up from the sea, and supported in its hold over the human world by co-opting religion with the deepest impulses of the human heart in the service of these false ends. In the intervening chapters, these values, practices, and insights are intensified as the structure of the book of Revelation is a kind of spiral. Immediately before chapters 21 and 22, there is a brief but powerful exposition of the fate of those who have aligned themselves with Rome and with Satan as they are marched down into the lake of fire that burns forever and ever. We want then and now to avoid that fate. And that perhaps is why the book of Revelation climaxes not with threat, but with the extraordinary vision of the new heaven and the new earth unfolded in chapters 21 and 22. The visionary part of this material depicts a city. Again, as in all of the book of Revelation images, the elements of the vision are symbols that point to deeper, broader, more meaningful realities. The new city is not just a new city, but a new heaven and a new earth. It comes down out of heaven, and the barrier between heaven and earth disappears in the reality of what the writer calls the New Jerusalem, a reconstitution of all that is in the image of a city. John describes it as radiant, as luminescent to the degree that it would almost be hard for your eyes to fall upon it. The city is surrounded by a wall. In antiquity, the wall was a symbol of safety and security. And some wall this is, 144 cubits. That's about the same height as a 20-story building, which in the world of the ancients would have promised a security that was almost unimaginable because it could not be breached. But there is something really striking about this wall, and that is that it is opened by 12 gates. 4 on each side. During the period of the walled cities, actually a little earlier than the time of the book of Revelation, many cities would have only 1 or 2 gates, and they would be closed at night, and there might be a small gate nearby for a late arriving traveler to enter, but by and large the city was sealed up, and even in the daytime allowed only limited access as a measure of precaution. Here, 12 gates, 3 on each side. Now I recognize that danger of reading one's own contemporary agenda into the past, but it is striking here that security, represented by the 20-story building, is achieved not by keeping people out, but by making it possible for people to come in. And not only that, but the city is 4 square, and not only that, but its width and its depth are square with its height. This, of course, recollects the Holy of Holies, the most sacred space in Judaism, and is John's way of saying that the purposes of God, the holy purposes of God that are represented in the temple in the Holy of Holies, now permeate the entire community. And this sense of permeation overflows in the way in which the city is described. It is measured, which is an ancient way of saying that the city has been brought under God's control. If you were buying property, you would go out and measure it before sealing the deal so that you know what part was under your control. God has had this whole city measured with a gold measuring rod as a saying that its life is under control. It is described, as popular mythology has it, as a city of gold. Then, as now, gold was the most valuable of elements. But there is something unusual about this gold. It is like glass. So this is a way of saying that this community and its qualities of life are as valuable as gold, but they are not subject to the misuse that human beings so often make of gold in its goldness. Its value, as it were, is transformed into something that is luminescent and transparent. In a world in which so much takes place behind closed doors, how welcome it is to think of God's purposes taking place in a world that is transparent. There are 12 foundation stones, and John names them according to a long list. Foundations of the wall are jasper, sapphire, agate, emerald, etc. All valuable jewels, again testifying to the value of this community. And I'm not so sure this is right, but the British scholar R.H. Charles of many generations ago hypothesizes that these stones are a reference to the stones of the zodiac, popular in Roman religious practice, but out of order as a way of saying that the control that people desire through the zodiac and the means that it represents, you don't get control over life in that way. You get control over life. You get the kind of safe life that you want by participating in the purposes of God, which point toward a community of mutual support. There is no temple in this city because God and the Lamb are ever present. And the function of a temple is to demonstrate the presence and make available the restorative powers of the divine to the community. Here, no temple is needed because the presence permeates all, and the restorative powers have operated to such an extent that John describes it as a new heaven and a new earth. It is a constitution, reconstitution of the cosmos. No need for sun or moon here because the light of God permeates it all. Little anti-Roman polemic here. The Romans worshiped the sun, the moon, and the stars. Not here. Those are false objects of worship, however important they may have been to the old creation. And there is a sobering side to this vision. The kings of the earth, the rulers of the earth, will bring their glory into it. They will recognize that what they had hoped to achieve by establishing their personal dominions cannot be achieved in that way, but only by subscribing to the mutually supportive vision of community that God has in mind for all. And as a sobering continuation, John says, there will be nothing in it that practices abomination or falsehood. That is to say, these things no longer have a place in the community of God. They have been excluded. And then John says, through the middle of the city flows the river of the water of life. This, of course, is a vision that was articulated in a semi-arid climate in which water was necessary for life. And multiple times in the first 39 books, there is an association between water and generativity, an association between what God makes possible in the way of sustaining life. Here, the river flows through the middle of the city, and the image is of perpetual generativity. It also calls to mind Ezekiel and the vision of the last temple, out of which flows water from the Holy of Holies, splashing across the court of the temple, out the gates of the temple, along the streets of the city, out of the street of the city, down through the desert toward the Dead Sea. Everywhere it goes, cleansing, bringing growth, grass, flowers, trees. And when it gets to the Dead Sea, it forms at first a small pool of fresh water on the edge of the sea, which then expands and becomes a large pool of fresh water. Now, I do not think John has this in mind, but it certainly comes to my mind to see the river of the water of life as an image for immersion or baptism, that when we leave the old world and join the community on its way to this new heaven and new earth, we are immersed into a process of cleansing and growth and generativity, that we who were once hard like the desert soil become malleable and fertile. And whether or not that relates to baptism, John certainly depicts the tree of life here depicted as being on both sides of the river. Tree of life, of course, is a symbol that comes from the book of Genesis as a way of pointing to the power that is at work in the world to sustain life, especially as the human family cooperates with nature and its cycles and purposes. This is a way of saying that that sustaining power is at the center of this new community, and it gives fruit. It does not just give fruit, but it gives fruit 12 months of the year. Fruit, of course, is a symbol in Judaism for way of life. You bear good fruit or bad fruit. Here, those who are inhabitants of this community, taking advantage of its security, its resources for generativity, give the fruit of the way of God all month, every month, all year. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. I have to say, I wondered about this for the longest time. Why would leaves be for healing? And the answer is that leaves in antiquity were often ground up and made into a paste for medicine. The leaves of the tree are the medicine that the world needs in order to become such a community. And what is that medicine? In the book of Revelation, it is summarized in one word: repentance. Repentance in Jewish tradition, and particularly in the book of Revelation, is a most positive and dynamic action. It is taking account of your circumstance and seeing how closely you are aligned with Satan and the empires of the world, and turning away and turning toward God and God's values of love, peace, justice, and abundance. When you take that medicine, then you are on the road to healing. And there is nothing cursed here. The language of curse harkens back to Genesis 3, when the first couple disobeyed the only commandment that God gave them, and as a consequence, God placed a curse, not only then on them, but on the world, so that until the new heaven and the new earth, the world is always to some degree broken and never quite fulfilling God's purposes. The curse does not obviate the possibility of life, but it limits the possibilities of life, and entering into the community of the new heaven and the new earth releases even more of those possibilities. And John says, there will be no night there. Night is one of those Jewish symbols for being unable to perceive the presence and purposes of God as fully as you can, making your way through life groping, doing the best that you can, taking advantage of the light that God has given. But now there is a world in which God is fully perceived and in which you can fully respond. And then, at the very end, John says, and they, meaning the inhabitants of this community, will reign forever and ever. And I have to say at first, that kind of puffed me up a bit. I am a prince. Oh, I may be a king. Whether a prince or a king, I reign, I rule, have authority. Then I remember what the elders did with their crowns in chapter 4. They place their crowns before the one who sits on the throne. How do the faithful reign? By serving the purposes of God. Now, on the one hand, this vision is of a future world, a reconstitution of all that is, that from John's point of view will take place only after the second coming. On the other hand, from John's point of view, the church, in its present life, can anticipate this world by repenting and by living according to the values and practices of God, and by witnessing to those practices to the empire forces that are all around us, alerting them to the possibility of turning away from idolatry and injustice and violence and turning toward these ways and finding a quality of life that is never available to them. Now, I am aware, in fact, I am part of a group that does not anticipate an actual occurrence of a second coming. Whether or not it ever comes about, I am confident that God will never cease offering opportunities in every situation to participate in its qualities. We began this series by noting there are many different interpretations of the book of Revelation, and there are many different interpretations of the meaning and timing and even possibility of the coming of this new heaven and new earth. Many Christians believe it, anticipate it, build their lives on it, look forward to it, want to inhabit it. Some others are less confident that it will occur in the literal way in which it is described here, but they too can draw inspiration and hope from the fact that God envisions life and gives a power for life to become so very differently than we know it today. And regardless of where one finds oneself on this interpretive spectrum, certainly there is a sense in which this vision can function as a blueprint for the life of the church as a community of mutual support, casting the light of God in a world that is so very dark.